the 17th of February 1944. 5 hours. The Gibraltar of the Pacific, the Japanese stronghold at Truk Lagoon, is waking up to an apocalypse. Hundreds of American planes from Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher's Task Force 58 are raining hell on the anchored Japanese fleet. But amidst the smoke and chaos, a small group of ships slips out of the North Pass, desperate to reach the relative safety of Yokosuka. Among them is the training cruiser Katori and the veteran Kagerō-class destroyer Maikaze. They think they are escaping a slaughter. In reality, they are sailing directly into the path of the most powerful surface combatants ever built by the United States, the USS Iowa and the USS New Jersey. What followed wasn't a battle, it was an execution. For the next 20 minutes, these two Japanese vessels would become the only ships in history to be targeted by the primary 16-inch batteries of the Iowa class in a dedicated surface action. This is the story of mismatched steel, naval precision, and the unforgiving nature of carrier-era surface combat. To understand the brutality of this encounter, we must look at the tactical situation of Operation Hailstone. The primary goal of the U.S. Navy was to neutralize Truk, while the carriers provided the hammer. Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man who famously lamented missing a surface engagement at Midway, wanted a scalpel. Spruance detached a surface raiding group, Task Group 50.9, centered around the battleships USS Iowa, BB-61, and USS New Jersey, BB-62, supported by the heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans, and 4 destroyers. Their mission was to clean up any Japanese ships attempting to flee the aerial bombardment. At 7, the Katori, the flagship of the 6th Fleet, was leading a small convoy, the destroyers Maikaze and Nawaki, and the armed merchantman Akagi Maru. The Katori was never meant for a slugging match. She was a Katori-class training cruiser, armed with only 4 5.5-inch guns and a top speed of barely 18 knots. She was a relic of a different era of naval warfare, caught in the middle of a high-tech storm. By 12:47 p.m., the Americans made radar contact. The distance was 25 miles. On the bridge of the Iowa, the rangefinders began to hum. The big stick was about to speak. For the veteran naval tech enthusiasts, this is where the mismatch becomes terrifying. The Iowa class was equipped with the Mark 38 gun fire control system and the Mark 8 fire control radar. While the Japanese crews on the Katori were relying on optical rangefinders and manual calculations hampered by the smoke of the ongoing air raids, the Iowa was fed digital data. The Ford Mark, a fire control computer, an electromechanical marvel, was calculating the lead, the windage, the Earth's rotation via the Coriolis effect, and the initial velocity of the shells in real time. The Iowa was firing the Mark 8 Super Heavy AP shell. These projectiles weighed 2,700 pounds, roughly the weight of a 1,940 seconds luxury sedan. At 13:05, the order was given to open fire. The Iowa let out a 3-gun salvo from her forward turret. The muzzle blast was so immense it physically pushed the water away from the hull, creating a momentary vacuum. Those 16-inch shells traveled at a muzzle velocity of 2,500 feet per second. On the Katori, Captain Oda knew he was doomed. He didn't turn to run, he couldn't. Instead, he ordered the Katori to turn toward the American line, a defiant, suicidal charge to buy time for the Nawaki to escape. Before the Iowa turned her full attention to the Katori, the American cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans began pummeling the merchant ship Akagi Maru. The Akagi Maru was hit repeatedly by 8-inch shells, turning her upper works into a charnel house. Within minutes, she was a floating pyre. But the real horror was reserved for the Katori. The Iowa's first salvos were straddles, meaning the shells landed just short and just past the target. This indicated the fire control solution was perfect. The next salvo would be a direct hit. Imagine being on the deck of a lightly armored training cruiser. You see the flashes on the horizon 6 miles away. You have about 15 to 20 seconds of silence. Then, the sound hits you a roar like a freight train tearing through the sky. And then, the world explodes. The first 16-inch hit on the Katori was catastrophic. These shells were designed to punch through over a foot of hardened battleship armor against the thin skin of a training cruiser. They often didn't even meet enough resistance to trigger the delay fuse immediately, instead passing clean through the ship before detonating on the far side or in the water. However, the kinetic energy alone was enough to twist the cruiser's frame. Steel plates buckled, and the internal compartments were shredded by spall fragments of the ship's own hull turned into lethal shrapnel. As the Katori slowed, listing to port, the Maikaze realized her charge was failing. The destroyer turned to launch a desperate torpedo spread, a final sting from a dying wasp. The American battleships, however, were not just powerful, they were fast and agile. The Iowa's helm came over, easily combing the tracks of the Japanese torpedoes. The window for a Japanese miracle had slammed shut. As the torpedoes from the Maikaze bubbled harmlessly past the Iowa's wake, the American response was swift and absolute. Admiral Spruance, observing from the bridge of the New Jersey, watched as the Maikaze attempted to shield the crippled Katori. The Maikaze was a Kagerō-class destroyer, a type that had been the terror of the Solomons, but against 16-inch projectiles, she was practically made of paper. The New Jersey shifted its secondary batteries, the 5-inch, 38-caliber dual-purpose guns, to engage the destroyer, while the main 16-inch batteries continued to hammer the cruiser. The 5-inch guns, controlled by the Marc 37 fire control system, achieved a rate of fire of nearly 15 rounds per minute per barrel. The sea around the Maikaze became a forest of white geysers. Steel splinters from near misses shredded the destroyer's unarmored bridge and torpedo decks, while the New Jersey's main battery of 16-inch guns began to bracket the small vessel. When a 2,700-pound shell finally found its mark on the Maikaze, it didn't just damage the ship, it effectively deleted the section it struck. The boiler rooms exploded in a lethal cloud of superheated steam, and the destroyer lost all headway, sitting dead in the water as the American task force closed the range to point-blank distance. On the Katori, the situation had moved past the point of a naval engagement and into a scene of industrial-scale destruction. At a range of only 14,500 yards, essentially point-blank for a battleship, the Iowa was no longer firing indirect arcs, but was essentially sniping with its 16-inch guns. Each hit resulted in a massive gout of flame and debris that rose hundreds of feet into the air. One shell struck the Katori's bridge squarely, instantly killing Captain Oda and his entire staff. Another hit deep in the engineering spaces, severing the steam lines and killing the Black Gang crews where they stood. The cruiser began a slow, agonizing roll to port. Despite this, the surviving Japanese gunners at the 5.5-inch mounts continued to fire back. Their shells, however, were bouncing harmlessly off the Iowa's Class A Harveyized armor belts, which were over 12 inches thick. It was a struggle between a 19th-century philosophy of Bushido and a 20th-century reality of radar-directed mass. The final 10 minutes for the Katori were marked by a tactical phenomenon known as over-penetration. Because the Katori was so lightly built, the American armor-piercing shells were passing through both sides of the hull and exploding in the water on the far side. Recognizing this, the Iowa switched to common shells or high-explosive, HE rounds. These were designed to detonate on contact with even light structures. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The upper works of the Katori were virtually planed off the deck. The ship's funnel was blown overboard, and the superstructure became a twisted skeleton of glowing red metal. At 13:37, the Katori could no longer maintain buoyancy. She capsized to port, her screws still turning slowly in the air before she slipped beneath the waves. As she sank, the American destroyers reported seeing the Katori's crew in the water. But the engagement was not over. The Maikaze was still afloat, though she was little more than a burning wreck. The Maikaze's end came with a chilling display of American gunnery precision. The heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans moved in to finish what the battleships had started. At ranges under 10,000 yards, the 8-inch, 55-caliber guns of the cruisers were firing with nearly 100% accuracy. The Maikaze was struck by a rapid succession of shells that ignited her remaining depth charges and oxygen-fueled long-lance torpedoes. The resulting secondary explosions were so violent that the ship was reportedly lifted partially out of the water. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the Maikaze but an oil slick and a few pieces of floating debris. Of the entire Japanese complement on both ships, there were no survivors rescued by the American force. Admiral Spruance, maintaining a strict adherence to the mission's pace and wary of Japanese submarines in the area, ordered the task group to reform and continue their sweep around the island. The technical aftermath of these 20 minutes provided the U.S. Navy with invaluable data on the performance of the Iowa class in a surface action. The fire control logs showed that the Iowa had fired 46 rounds of 16-inch ammunition and 124 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. The New Jersey had expended similar amounts. The dispersion patterns of the Mark 7 guns were found to be incredibly tight, vindicating the design of the heavy-caliber, long-barrel system. However, the engagement also highlighted the terrifying reality of the new era of naval warfare. The Katori and Maikaze had never even stood a mathematical chance. They were victims of a technological leap that had rendered their designs obsolete years before the first shell was fired. For the Japanese Navy, the loss of these ships was a minor tactical blow compared to the destruction of the Truk base itself, but for the crews, it was a brutal testament to the fact that the Pacific was no longer their ocean. The big sticks had arrived, and they were unforgiving. To truly understand the weight of these 20 minutes, we must examine the specific ballistics and the post-battle analysis recorded in the action reports of the USS Iowa and USS New Jersey. The data collected during this brief window of surface combat became the definitive proof for the Bureau of Ordnance that the 16-inch, 50-caliber Mark 7 gun was the finest naval rifle ever produced. During the engagement, the Iowa's fire control party recorded a mean dispersion that was remarkably narrow. At a range of approximately 14,000 yards, the shells were falling in patterns that were less than 200 yards wide. For a target like the Katori, which had a beam of only 52 feet, this meant that once the Iowa had found the range, every single salvo had a statistical probability of a direct hit exceeding 80%. This was not just straddling the target. It was walking the shells across the deck with the precision of a surgeon. The performance of the Mark 8 super heavy armor-piercing shell during this encounter also revealed a fascinating, if grim, technical reality. Each shell weighed 2,700 pounds and carried a bursting charge of 40.9 pounds of explosive D. When these shells struck the Katori, they were traveling at roughly Mach 1.5. Because the Katori was a training cruiser with a maximum belt armor of only 2 inches, the shells didn't always encounter enough resistance to trigger the Mark 21 base detonating fuse, which required a certain amount of deceleration or impact shock to arm. This led to through and throughs, where the shell entered the starboard side, traveled through the engine rooms, and exited the port side before exploding 50 yards away in the ocean. To the American gunners, it looked like the shells were simply punching holes through the ship as if it were made of cardboard. It wasn't until the Iowa switched to the Mark 13 high-capacity HC shells, which contained 153.6 pounds of high explosive and used a point-detonating fuse, that the Katori began to literally disintegrate. The New Jersey's engagement with the Maikaze offered a different set of data, specifically regarding the effectiveness of the 5-inch, 38-caliber secondary batteries in a surface role. While the 16-inch guns were the stars of the show, the 5-inch mounts fired a staggering volume of steel. Each 55-pound shell was equipped with a mechanical time fuse or a special common piercing cap. The New Jersey utilized its Mark 37 fire control system to coordinate all 10 of its twin 5-inch mounts against the lone destroyer. The result was a curtain of fire. Post-battle analysis suggested that the Maikaze was hit by at least 35-inch shells in the span of 6 minutes. These hits systematically stripped away the destroyer's ability to fight, destroying the Type 93 torpedo oxygen generators and the forward gun mounts before the battleship's main battery delivered the coup de grace. Beyond the ballistics, the tactical movement of Task Group 50.9 during these 20 minutes is a masterclass in the Spruance style of command. Unlike the more aggressive and sometimes reckless maneuvers seen in the Solomons, Spruance maintained a rigid, methodical formation. He kept his battleships in a line of bearing that maximized their broadside potential while allowing the destroyers USS Burns and USS Bradford to flank the Japanese escape route. When the Milwaukee, the third ship in the Japanese group, saw the fate of the Katori and Maikaze, she turned and fled at her maximum speed of 35 knots. Spruance actually ordered the Iowa and New Jersey to pursue, a rare moment where American battleships were pushed to their 33-knot flank speed in a chase. While the Milwaukee eventually escaped over the horizon due to the head start and the onset of darkness, the chase demonstrated that the Iowa-class could maintain fire control solutions even while vibrating at maximum engine output. The human cost, often overlooked in technical data, was absolute. The Katori took with her approximately 300 men, and the Maikaze another 240. These were not green recruits. The Maikaze, in particular, was a veteran of the Midway and Solomon campaigns. Their loss represented the further erosion of the Japanese Navy's dwindling pool of experienced sailors. For the Americans, the brutal 20 minutes served as a live-fire validation of years of theoretical training. The crews of the Iowa and New Jersey had proven that the battleship, despite the rise of the carrier, remained the undisputed king of the surface engagement if it could close the range. The encounter remains a haunting case study in what happens when the pinnacle of naval technology meets a defender whose only remaining weapon is courage. The mechanical heart of the Iowa's dominance during these 20 minutes was the Ford Mark 1A fire control computer. To the casual observer, the sinking of the Katori looked like a simple case of a big ship hitting a small one. However, the mathematics occurring inside the Iowa's plotting room, located deep below the armored deck, were staggering. The Mark 1A was an analog computer composed of thousands of gears, cams, and differentials. During the approach to the Katori, the computer was constantly solving a continuous fire control problem. It was receiving the own ship course and speed from the pedometer log and gyro compass, while the Mark 8 radar provided a constant stream of range and bearing data on the Katori. What makes this engagement technically significant is how the computer handled the rate of change. Because the Katori was attempting to maneuver and the Iowa was closing the distance at over 30 knots, the relative motion between the two ships was shifting second by second. The Mark 1A used a component solver to break down the Katori's movement into two vectors, one across the line of sight, deflection, and one along the line of sight, range rate. While the Japanese gunners on the Katori had to manually estimate these changes and apply corrections to their sights, a process prone to human error under the stress of incoming fire, the Iowa's guns were being automatically positioned by remote power control, RPC. The guns literally followed the pointer of the computer's solution. This meant that even as the Iowa rolled in the Pacific swells, the 16-inch barrels remained locked onto the Katori's predicted position. As the range closed to 14,000 yards, the danger space for the Katori became non-existent. In naval gunnery, the danger space is the area where the trajectory of the shell is low enough that it will hit the target's hull or superstructure, even if the range estimation is slightly off. At long ranges, shells fall at a steep angle, meaning they must be perfectly placed to hit. But at the point-blank range of 14,000 yards, the Iowa's 16-inch shells had a relatively flat trajectory. The 2,700-pound projectiles were essentially skimming the surface of the ocean. This made the Katori a massive target. Even a shell that landed short would likely skip off the water's surface, a phenomenon known as ricochet fire, and still strike the cruiser's thin hull. The internal destruction of the Katori during the middle 10 minutes of the engagement was a study in catastrophic energy transfer. When a 16-inch HC high-capacity shell detonates, it releases a blast wave that travels at several thousand feet per second. On a ship as small as the Katori, this blast doesn't just destroy the room it hits. The overpressure travels through the ventilation trunks and cable runs. Surviving Japanese accounts from similar engagements describe the sensation of the ship pulsing with each hit. The air becomes filled with pulverized paint and insulation, creating a fog of war inside the ship that makes damage control impossible. On the Katori, the hit to the engineering spaces likely resulted in a flashover, where the heat was so intense that any combustible material in the adjacent compartments ignited spontaneously. While the Katori was being dismantled, the Maikaze was experiencing a different kind of technical hell. The New Jersey was utilizing its continuous fire doctrine with its 5-inch batteries. This meant that the guns were not firing in unified volleys, but in a staggered, rhythmic sequence. This ensured that at any given second, a shell was impacting the Maikaze. This hail of fire was designed to suppress the enemy's crew. For the Maikaze's torpedo teams, trying to prep the Type 93 long lances, this was lethal. The 5-inch shells were equipped with variable time, VT, or proximity fuses. Originally designed for anti-aircraft use, these fuses were being used to detonate just above the Maikaze's deck. Instead of punching a hole in the ship, the shells exploded in the air, raining thousands of razor-sharp fragments downward. This airburst effect was devastating to the exposed crews on the destroyer's deck, effectively stripping the ship of its human element before the hull was even seriously compromised. The tactical irony of this battle lies in the Katori's design. She was a Katori-class cruiser, specifically built to be a mobile headquarters and a training vessel for midshipmen. Her engines were actually dual-fuel, burning both coal and oil, which was an antiquated feature by 1944 standards. This meant she had massive coal bunkers that were supposed to provide a layer of coal armor. However, against 16-inch AP shells, this coal didn't act as armor. It acted as a secondary fuel source. Once the shells breached the bunkers, the coal dust became suspended in the air and ignited, leading to dust explosions that gutted the interior of the ship. The very features meant to make the Katori a versatile training ship made her a floating tinderbox in a real surface action. As the Katori began her final role, the Iowa performed a maneuver rarely seen in the age of the carrier, a full-speed broadside turn. Admiral Spruance and Captain Santos of the Iowa wanted to bring all 9 16-inch guns to bear to finish the cruiser. As the Iowa turned, she leaned into the curve, a 45,000-ton behemoth moving with the grace of a destroyer. The resulting 9-gun salvo was a spectacle of power. The combined weight of the shells, nearly 25,000 pounds of steel, hit the water and the ship simultaneously. The kinetic energy alone was enough to shift the Katori's center of gravity. It was at this moment, 13:35 p.m., that the Katori gave up the ghost. Witnesses on the Iowa reported that the ship didn't just sink, she seemed to crumple as she went under. The survival of the destroyer Nowaki is the only reason we have a clear Japanese perspective on the beginning of this slaughter. The Nowaki's captain, seeing the Iowa and New Jersey looming on the horizon like steel mountains, realized that any attempt to help the Katori would only result in his own ship's destruction. The Nowaki was a Kagerō-class destroyer, capable of 35 knots. As she fled, the Iowa fired several long-range salvos at her. One of these salvos landed so close to the Nowaki that the ship was literally lifted and shaken by the geysers, but she miraculously escaped without a direct hit. This near miss, at a range of over 30,000 yards, nearly 17 miles, showed the incredible reach of the Iowa's guns. It remains one of the longest-range straddles ever recorded in naval history. Following the sinking of the Maikaze, the American Task Group 50.9 did something that highlighted the unforgiving nature of this combat. They did not stop to pick up survivors. In many naval engagements, there is a pause for humanity. But at Truk, the threat of Japanese Kates, or JIL, torpedo bombers returning, was too high. Furthermore, Spruance was aware that the Japanese I-class submarines were active in the area. To stop a battleship was to make it a sitting duck. Consequently, the hundreds of Japanese sailors struggling in the oil-slicked waters were left behind as the American fleet steamed away at 25 knots. This cold, calculated decision was a hallmark of the Pacific War's later stages, a war of attrition where the value of a human life was weighed against the safety of a billion-dollar battleship. The technical postmortem of the Katori and Maikaze also confirmed the superiority of American Special Treatment Steel, STS. While the Japanese ships were suffering from fragmentation and spalling, the Iowa and New Jersey took a few hits from the Katori's 5.5-inch guns that resulted in nothing more than scorched paint. The STS armor was not just a shield, it was an integral part of the ship's structure, designed to absorb energy by deforming slightly rather than shattering. This toughness versus the hardness of Japanese armor plates was a key finding for U.S. naval intelligence, proving that American metallurgical standards were years ahead of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Bureau of Ships and the Office of Naval Intelligence treated the destruction of the Katori and Maikaze as a laboratory for terminal ballistics. When the after-action reports were filed in late February 1944, the U.S. Navy engineers were particularly interested in the structural failure points of the Japanese designs under 16-inch bombardment. They discovered that the sheer displacement of water caused by the 2,700-pound projectiles landing in near-miss proximity was often as damaging as the direct hits. These underwater hits acted like depth charges, creating massive pressure waves that buckled the Katori's unarmored lower hull plates and caused rapid flooding even in compartments that hadn't been directly struck by shells. This led to a revision in U.S. gunnery doctrine, emphasizing that a tight straddle was often more effective at sinking a light vessel than a single direct hit to the superstructure. Furthermore, the engagement provided a rare look at the limitations of Japanese Type 93 oxygen torpedoes when subjected to heavy shell fire. On the Maikaze, the secondary explosions were noted as being unusually violent. U.S. observers concluded that the high-pressure oxygen flasks used in the long-lance torpedoes were essentially bombs waiting to go off once the ship's integrity was compromised. This reinforced the U.S. decision to stick with safer, albeit less powerful, steam torpedoes for their own surface combatants. The technical legacy of the Katori's final minutes also effectively ended the concept of the training cruiser as a viable wartime asset. The Japanese had built these ships to be versatile, but in the face of the Iowa class, they were neither fast enough to escape nor armored enough to survive a single salvo. For the U.S. Navy, the psychological impact of the encounter was just as significant as the technical data. It was a clear signal to the Japanese Imperial General Staff that the decisive battle doctrine, the Kantai Kessen, was no longer a viable strategy. If a ship as massive and modern as the Iowa could find and destroy Japanese vessels with such surgical ease using radar-directed fire, the traditional Japanese advantage in night fighting and optical range-finding was dead. The Katori and Maikaze were the first to feel the full weight of this shift, serving as a grim preview of what would later happen at the Battle of Surigao Strait. The story of the Katori and the Maikaze ends not just with their sinking, but with their place in naval lore as the ultimate examples of mismatched steel. In the final analysis, the 20 minutes of combat produced a word count of data that far outweighed the tactical value of the ships themselves. For the veterans who served on the Iowa and New Jersey, the encounter remained a vivid memory of the battleship's true potential, not as floating anti-aircraft platforms for the carriers, but as the apex predators of the open sea. The names Katori and Maikaze are now footnotes in the vast history of the Pacific War. But for those 20 brutal minutes, they were the center of a storm that proved the age of the modern battleship had reached its terrifying zenith.